Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be reviewing the second round series between the Sharks and the Avalanche, in which the Sharks managed to win in 7 games, 4-3. So the Sharks came into this series after a hard-fought, tough battle with probably their biggest rival, at least at the moment, the Vegas Golden Knights. It took 7 games to defeat them. The Sharks had to come back from the brink of elimination, down 3-1 in that series, force a Game 7 and take it in overtime just to be able to move on to the second round. The Avalanche had it easier with how the series went, but they didn't really have that much of an easier opponent. They faced off against, at least in the regular season, the Western Conference's best team statistically, the Calgary Flames, who led the way in the Pacific Division, who looked like they could be a threat coming into the playoffs, knocked off by the 8th seed in the Western Conference, the lowest seed in the entire playoffs, if I'm not mistaken, the Colorado Avalanche, in just 5 games. After the Flames got that first game shutout, it looked like that's how the series might go, but the Avalanche stormed back, win 4 straight, and so they had a lot more rest coming into this series against the San Jose Sharks, and yet I still felt as though, for my original prediction, that the Sharks would be able to take it to the Avalanche, but in just 5 games, but it seems as though I, like potentially the Calgary Flames, underestimated that team, had a lot more fight in them than I thought, and so this series, once again for the Sharks, did reach the 7-game mark before the Sharks managed to end up coming out victorious, closing it out at home in Game 7. That was by a score of 3-2, and the series was over then. The Sharks move on to face the St. Louis Blues in the third round. For X factors for this series, of course, I wanted to change it up a bit from the first round, so instead of going with Martin Jones, I decided to go with Erik Karlsson, as he was a bit of a liability defensively in the first round against the Golden Knights, even if he was strong offensively. And in this series, observing Erik Karlsson was interesting, as he actually played rather well for the first half of this series. Through the first 4 or 5 games, he was doing well offensively, but also pretty well defensively, as he didn't really have too many issues. However, that really began to fall apart in the last couple of games, especially both Game 6 and Game 7. He was probably one of the worst Sharks defenders, making a lot of mistakes. In Game 7, he took a couple of very unnecessary penalties. He got walked around a couple of times, especially Game 6, he was responsible for that game-tying goal, or at least partially responsible for the the go-ahead goal, actually, the first goal of that third period that made it 3-2. So it wasn't the best finish for Erik Karlsson in this series, and he also wasn't as impactful as I thought he would be. When it came to the Avalanche, I had their top line, of course, being the X factor, and yet that top line was not actually put together to start a game up until Game 4. They kept them separated at least for the first 20 to sometimes 30 minutes of the game in all of Games 1, 2, and 3. For whatever reason, the Avalanche ended up being just 1 and 2 in those 3 games. Eventually, they were reunited for Game 4 onwards, which of course they ended up with a record of 2-2 over those games, but it was too late and they lost the series. The Avs top line started this series off actually pretty well offensively. McKinnon was very strong through the first 3 games, but he ended up falling off somewhat while Landeskog finally brought it back, as he wasn't that great at the start of the series. Rantanen and McKinnon really calmed down in terms of points. It seems as though maybe the Sharks found something that could shut them down for those last few games, and that was pretty key in the Sharks being able to hold off the Avalanche somewhat offensively in a lot of those games. In Games 4, 5, and 7, they actually only managed to score 2 goals at most. In Game 5, it was actually only 1 goal. Of course, Game 4, they still scored 3, but it was an empty net. Only in Game 6 did they actually manage to find the back of the net, and that was because of the Avalanche depth. And so the Sharks managed to shut down, at least partially, that Avalanche top line, which allowed them to get this series victory, or at least helped. In Game 1 of this series, as I said, the Sharks, it was looking like they might come out as the better team, of course, because they had been, still in the hockey spirit, coming off only a couple days earlier when they defeated the Golden Knights, while the Avalanche had multiple days off. However, the Avalanche were actually surprisingly the better team to start Game 1 in the first period. They got that first goal of the series, but eventually, as time went on, it seems like the Sharks found their legs. The third line was very good in this game, allowed the Sharks to storm back in that second period, ended the second with a 4-2 lead, and ended the game in the end with a 5-2 lead. So the Sharks claimed once again a Game 1 victory in this series, like they did against the Golden Knights, and once again by the score of 5-2. But they didn't want to fall into the same mistake they made last series when they won game 1 but then lost the next 3 games, and they also didn't want to fall into the same mistake that the Flames made when they defeated the Avalanche in game 1 but then ended up losing the series in the next 4 games. But they ended up losing game 2 anyhow, even though this game ended up being somewhat close score-wise, as it was a 4-3 victory for the Avalanche, with an empty netter being the game winner. The Avalanche had the 3-1 lead at some point, a couple of calls going their way, a missed icing, a missed tripping call at the end that led to the empty net goal, and so it was the Avalanche who managed to come out on top 4-3 and split in San Jose, which is probably as much as they could have possibly hoped for when playing those first 2 games. So now the Sharks had to head to Denver for games 3 and 4, and they were going to have to hope for a split so they can try and get home ice advantage back. And a split they got thanks to what happened in game 3. The Sharks with a 2-0 lead early on that ended up crumbling as more time passed, and eventually the Avalanche managed to tie it at 2 with about 8 or 10 minutes left in the third period, but it would be Logan Couture with his second goal of the game at the time to make it 3-2, and eventually with an empty net goal to get the hat trick in that game and claim the victory 4-2 to give the Sharks back home ice advantage in this series and a 2-1 series lead. We then stuck in Denver for game 4. The Sharks offense completely falling apart. At this point, the Sharks from game 1 got great contributions from their third line. In games 3, they had a huge game from Logan Couture, but it seemed like no one managed to step up in game 4. No goals at all to speak of. And so while the goaltending was still strong, the defense was still pretty good. The Avalanche only managed 2 actual goals on a manned net. The Sharks managed none, and they were shut out 3-0 as we went back to San Jose to finish off what would end up being a best of 3 for the rest of the series. Game 5 in San Jose, this is when the Sharks managed to turn it around against the Golden Knights, and they managed to get a victory in Game 5 once again here against the Colorado Avalanche, a game dominated by the San Jose Sharks, but Philip Grubauer, very, very good in this game, managed to limit the Sharks to just 2 goals. However, Jones just a touch better, thanks in part also to the Sharks' defense playing rather well in this game. He only let in a single goal, even if that single goal was the first goal of the game. It was Tomas Hertl who got the other 2 for the Sharks, and they managed to take it 2-1 and have a huge advantage as they had to head back to Colorado for Game 6. Game 6 started out a lot like Game 4, the Sharks not getting anything in terms of offensive contributions, and it was a bit of a worry through the first parts of this series because in Games 1, Games 3, and Games 5, it hasn't really been a full team contribution and has instead just been maybe one line or even just one specific player stepping up at the correct time. And Game 6 didn't seem like it was going to have any of that until Timo Meier managed to make a good rush to the net. Marc-Edouard Vlasic gets the goal, ties that game up at 1, and then we start trading goals. The Avalanche never actually relinquishing the lead, but the San Jose Sharks always managing to stay in step with them, and eventually we went to overtime for the first time this series. Now, both teams were 2-0 in overtimes thus far in this playoffs. The Avalanche, I don't remember which specific games, but were 2-0 against the Flames. The Sharks in Games 6 and 7 managed to defeat the Vegas Golden Knights in overtime, including a second overtime in Game 6. So both teams put their perfect overtime records to the test, and just a couple minutes in, it was the Colorado Avalanche who managed to come out on top. The Sharks losing their first playoff overtime this series, and it was once again, or in this playoffs, and it was once again a tie series, this time 3-3 going into the all-deciding Game 7. And just like Game 5, this one was back in San Jose, and the Sharks were dominating early. The first 40 minutes belonged almost entirely to the San Jose Sharks. The Avalanche had some moments in the first period, but really not too much doing, and it was also plagued by a bit of controversy as a goal for the Avalanche was called back on an offside challenge, a good offside challenge by the Sharks, a goal that could have potentially tied it 2-2, but it did not. The Sharks still led 2-1 at that point, and then they managed to make it 3-1 by the end of the second period, so a big momentum swing there. Come into the third period, the Avalanche get a very early goal and are the much better team in the third period, but they just can't seem to get one more puck past Martin Jones. The Sharks' defense, while floundering a bit, allowing the Avalanche to have a lot of zone time, they bend, but they do not break, and eventually the Sharks manage to close it out and get the 3-2 victory for the 4-3 series victory. As I said, they move on to face the Blues in the next round. For the offensive contributors of the series, Brent Burns led the way for all players by a lot. 4 goals, 6 assists for 10 points. Now, 7 of those points did come within the first couple of games. 4 points in Game 1, 3 points in Game 2. He also had 2 points all the way down in Game 7. So from Games 3 to 6, he only actually had a single point. So 10 points seems a lot more dominant than it was, but he was very good during the first couple of games. He was also very strong during Game 7 offensively. And just in general, over the full series, he was pretty good defensively. A couple of off games, a couple of bad plays, but in general, paired with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, a very solid series, and he was a huge part for why the Sharks were able to shut down somewhat that Avs top line. He played a ton of minutes. Next, Logan Couture, 3 goals, 3 assists for 6 points. Those 3 goals all coming in the same game, Game 3. He was part of the Sharks' most consistent line this series, as the third line was pretty invisible past Game 1, and the second line was there in spurts somewhat, maybe a bit apparent in Game 2. Hertl obviously had a couple goals in Game 5, and then Game 7 with the return of Pavelski. That was huge in that second line's performance, as Tomas Hertl also clocks in with 3 goals, 3 assists, and 6 points. Again, Hertl's series wasn't actually that great. He had a couple of assists, even if he wasn't that great in Game 2. He was huge in Game 5, and he was huge in Game 7, so he comes up in the clutch, but you'd like to see a bit more of a consistent performance from him. And Timo Meier, also part of that very consistent first line, 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points with him, and not listed here, Gustav Nyquist, a goal and 4 assists for 5 points, was the third party on that first line as well for the Sharks, which was, as I said, the most consistent line for the Sharks in this series, and was a big part for why the Sharks were able to, stick around even when some of their offensive players were a bit cold during this series. For the Avalanche, leading the way was unsurprisingly, Nathan MacKinnon, but surprisingly with just 5 points, 3 goals, and 2 assists. As I said, he got the majority of those points during the first 3 games, as he sort of fell off in the last 4. Mikko Rantanen also there with 1 goal, 4 assists for 5 points. Landeskog, the final piece of that first line, had 2 goals and 2 assists, but I did not have him listed here because I had Tyson Jost, 3 goals, 1 assist for 4 points. He had a goal in each of the last 3 games of this series, so he was doing his best, at least for Colorado, to try and get that victory. And Cale Makar, a player who, of course, everyone was talking about, his first game as an NHL player was in the playoffs against the Flames. I think he now only has 10 or 11 career games in his career, and that is just in the playoffs, so certainly an interesting environment to come into for your first few games, and he performed quite admirably, even if he wasn't that great down the stretch in Game 7 especially, but 4 assists for him for 4 points was still pretty good for an NHL rookie. For the goaltenders, Martin Jones got the better of the stats at the very least, and of course the better of the series, 2.29 GAA with a .916 save percentage. GAA obviously quite impressive. The save percentage above average, but doesn't look that fantastic, mostly because of the fact that in a 7-game series, very small sample size, so that one poor game statistically will have a huge effect on what your save percentage is. So for instance, in Game 6 this series, he had about an .850 save percentage, which over the course of a 60-game season really won't move many decimal points of your save percentage, but in just 7 games it will. And so Jones in this series actually only had 2 of the 7 games in which he had a save percentage below .916, and yet that was enough to impact it, as otherwise he was pretty strong save percentage wise, also because the Avalanche didn't get too many shots during this series. And so even if the save percentage isn't looking that great, Jones did still have a very good series. Grubauer himself was also pretty solid in this series, although I felt slightly worse than Martin Jones, a 2.6 GAA with a .914 save percentage. Of course, GAA only takes into account your time on ice and the amount of goals you do let in, and so the fact that Grubauer got a lot more shots on net and a lot more good chances for the Sharks does impact the GAA to make it look a bit worse than it probably should be. And the .914 save percentage also maybe slightly above average there for Grubauer. As I said, he was probably a bit worse than Martin Jones in this series, maybe a couple of soft ones, a couple of not great games, but also a couple of very good games. He was a huge part of Colorado for why they even stuck around in both Games 5 and Game 7, although the Avalanche just couldn't get enough goals to support him, so he was definitely not at fault for the Avalanche's loss this series. He was quite good, maybe not as good as he was against the Flames, but still pretty solid. But that will do it for this review. As I've said a couple times now, the Sharks will be back in action on Saturday. They will face off against the St. Louis Blues. Game 1 will be, I think, as I said, Saturday. Hopefully the Sharks can get that game one, as they have managed to do in the past couple of series, but then hopefully at the same time they won't end up just losing game two and losing that advantage they would get. Both of those games are at home. The St. Louis Blues are a fantastic road team thus far in these playoffs, and the Sharks are going to look to finally not split at home in these playoffs. Class dismissed.